Now in this week's edition of Let's Talk Some Star Wars, we'll be taking a look at the results of the poll that asked the question, who do you think should be or should have been the main villain or big bad guy in Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker? I'll also, as usual, be reading and responding to some of your comments, as well as showing off all the artwork that was sent in to me this week. Okay, so let's right away take a look at the results, where we'll see that 46% of the some 54,000 who voted think Snoke should have finished what he started and been the main villain throughout the whole trilogy. There was then 22% of people who thought Darth Plagueis should have been revealed to be the big bad guy here at the end, while 13% agree with Palpatine or Sidious being the main villain, 12% thought it should have been Kylo Ren, and 7% thought it should have been something or someone else. And before I get to the comments, let me just take a quick moment to say thank you to everyone who votes, and especially to those of you who take the time to comment and or read through the other comments and upvote the ones you agree with. Also, a big thank you to those of you who send in your amazing artwork or other imagery. Many of them do put links to where their other work can be found, so if you've liked something that you've seen in this video and you want to let them know, please do go and do that or follow them on Instagram or wherever else it might be. Finally, a huge thank you to all of you who support me on Patreon. I know I don't thank you all enough, but I do greatly appreciate it, and I'm so thankful for the little community we've all forged together on Discord. Oh, and also just a thank you to everyone who watches. I truly do mean it when I say that this is both the most incredible and humbling experience of my life, and it's a true honor to get to talk some Star Wars with so many fellow fans, so thank you to everyone for that. Okay, all my gratitude out of the way, let's now get to some comments, starting as we always do with the top-rated comment, which this week came to us from a distraction who simply said, Kathleen Kennedy. And, well, I think this answer is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm simply going to move on to the next highest-rated comment, which came to us from CMD3 who said, it should have been Plagueis as Snoke. It would have made so much more sense to, especially since reincarnating himself would obviously have a lot of dark side force corruption, resulting in Snoke's mangled appearance. Okay, so first of all, I agree with you. Being this twisted and wretched looking being, I think it's pretty obvious he went through some type of horrific incident at some point, and likely had to use the dark side to do something as unnatural as to either come back from the dead or to save himself from dying when he really should have. Something not all too unlike Darth Maul, but maybe even more extreme, though living through your bottom half being chopped off is also pretty damn extreme. And kind of going along with all this, I'd really love to know if J.J. Abrams, when he came up with the character, had a strong idea, or any at all, about who or what Snoke really was. What had happened to him, and more importantly, how does he fit into the grand scheme of things or to the overall picture when we consider his existence really means the Force shouldn't have been in balance at the end of Return of the Jedi. I mean, if we take Abrams at his word, Palpatine coming back for Episode 9 was the plan all along, right? So, was there ever a plan or idea or a backstory for Snoke in place? Is it another good story for another time and another person to figure out? Or is Abrams lying, and did he have an idea for him, at least a rough one, and it just got all thrown out the window when Snoke was killed in The Last Jedi? And he's now talking out his ass about Palpatine being the plan all along. Okay, let's now move on to this comment from Rafiq Roberts, who said, Darth Plagueis. The perfect alley-oop was thrown in Episode 3, and instead of just dunking it, the sequel trilogy caught the ball, dribbled back, and shot a 3. The ball is still in the air. We'll see if it goes in, but it's not looking good. And I think this is a really good analogy, and as a lot of you know, I do love my sports meets Star Wars analogies. Anyway, that scene in Episode 3 where Palpatine tells Anakin the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise is not only one of my favorite moments in all of Star Wars, it's the perfect pass, the perfect foreshadowing or setup for a sequel trilogy. And though I think Snoke seemed interesting after Episode 7, and certainly could have worked as the overall villain even if he ultimately had nothing to do with Plagueis, not using Plagueis when, again, you had the perfect setup for him already in place does feel like taking a harder shot than you really needed to. But I'd argue it wasn't like taking a 3, it was like taking a really long 2, one from just inside the arc. Because I don't think Snoke executed perfectly scores higher than bringing in Plagueis and executing him or a story about him well. In other words, by not using Plagueis, they made this all so much harder than they needed to, with a very small chance of a greater payoff in the end. Okay, now let's move on to this comment from Nacho Gamer, who said, Snoke, literally the main cause of the fall of Ben Solo to the dark side, the creation of the First Order, and the exile of Luke Skywalker. Unfortunately for us, he didn't survive for the next movie. And you bring up some excellent points here. It's kind of funny or sad that the guy who is responsible for all of that, for everything that went wrong and led to the sequel trilogy needing to take place, if you will, is not the main villain somehow. It'd almost be like Palpatine doing everything he did in the prequels and being nowhere to be seen in the original trilogy. Though I'm kind of expecting Episode 9 to change our understanding of all of that, and that it was somehow Palpatine the whole time doing these things that Snoke now gets credit for, or currently gets credit for. I really think we'll learn that Snoke was nothing but a puppet of Palpatine's all along. Alright, next let's get to this comment from Tommy Faust, who sums up the argument for Plagueis really well. There is no easier way to tie the 9 films together than bringing in Plagueis. You don't need some complicated explanation in the film that confuses general audiences. You simply just say, he was the Emperor's former master who was thought to be long dead. You don't have to make him Snoke, but that sure is an easy thing to do. I mean, cheating death is this guy's thing after all. You can also tie him into the origin of the Skywalkers, how he and Palpatine may have accidentally created Anakin by meddling with the dark side, and how that entire family is sort of forever burdened with coming from darkness. You can then have Rey be the character that essentially saves the Skywalker family by helping to finally eliminate this plague on their family and have the Skywalkers rise above their past. But we all know that won't happen, oh well. Okay, now let's move on to this comment from Ryan McCarthy, who said, Snoke, no question about it. Palpatine died in 6. You build Snoke up to this mastermind who lived through both the Clone Wars and the Galactic Empire. He saw what Palpatine did to gain power, and yet you won't explore this guy who seized power in literally 30 years since Palpatine died. Why would someone be skulking in the shadows and emerge right after Palpatine died? How is that not worth exploring and telling? Then there's this comment from Luke DeFirst, who said, I really did like Snoke when seeing him in The Force Awakens. I was sincerely intrigued on what his story would be continuing and how bad of a guy he was. Snoke was kind of cool in The Last Jedi, but seemed off from the previous appearance. He came off a bit too cliche. Then of course on opening night, Ryan killed him off, which left me devastated and had my mouth open in shock and my hands in the air in frustration. It irritates me how Lucasfilm wants to come up with their own canon content, yet they don't do a thing for him. It's just confounding. Andy Serkis is a fantastic actor, and did justice for Snoke. To see the potential of his performance and Snoke's story is a true damn shame. My initial strong negative reaction to The Last Jedi is the reason why I didn't get a second date with this chick I went with who cried of happiness for the movie. Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear that The Last Jedi had a negative impact on your love life. But anyway, these are more excellent points here. Snoke was a great chance for them here in the Disney era to do something new and different with Star Wars, to add a completely new, interesting villain, but they completely squandered it in favor of bringing back one who was not only dead and gone, but already had a great story from beginning to end. And moving on now, let's get to this comment from Isaiah Boy, who said, Palpatine. Although it's a little cheesy and fan service-y, it connects the 3 trilogies nicely. A character that has been a villain in all 3, but never been the main villain, meeting his end at the end of 9 movies would be cool if executed really well. Then there's this comment from Ultra Knight, who said, I agree with JJ. Palp's returning makes narrative sense. Okay, so I don't entirely disagree with that. If done right, and that's a big if, Palpatine could have in some capacity been the overarching villain of all 3 trilogies, and maybe even should have been if planned out properly. Though instead of him actually coming back to life, I personally think it's better if it's just some offspring of his or a creation of his, or something along those lines. Something that doesn't involve him physically coming back in the flesh, or worse yet, having somehow survived the ending of Return of the Jedi, where he got tossed down a shaft and blown up. Not to mention, his death is just such a huge part of the overall story. It's so important to finishing off Anakin Skywalker's story. And bringing Palpatine back risks damaging that or lessening Anakin's sacrifice in some respect, even though you still can't take away the fact that yes, Anakin did give his life to save his son, which I think we can safely say was his biggest and pretty much only concern in that moment. I don't think Anakin was worried about or thinking about killing Palpatine per se, or balancing the Force. He was just trying to save his son. And there's really nothing this next movie can do to take that away, at least I think. Okay, and next up here we have this comment from Hardly Common, who said, the reason I say Kylo Ren is because when I first saw the character design, I was extremely impressed. And for the first few minutes of The Force Awakens, I thought he was ruthless and menacing. I loved the idea of him trying to follow in Vader's footsteps, perhaps not believing that Luke had redeemed him. The Knights of Ren were also a great concept, and would have made for some great action and storylines. Then they started tearing down the character piece by piece until finally he was no longer a viable big baddie anymore. It's really a shame. J.J. Abrams didn't do as great a job with the character as he could have, but he did leave plenty of room for Rian Johnson to make him cooler, but he just became another squandered opportunity of the sequel trilogy. And I was very much on board with Kylo Ren being a great new credible threat at the start of The Force Awakens, and he's still my favorite new character overall despite the way he's been handled. But since he can't beat Rey, he was flat out bested by her the first time they fought, and then the next time it was essentially a draw, I guess you could say. It's just hard to fear him or think of him as a real threat, or at least one that Rey couldn't just handle once again when they meet the next time. And that then brings us to this comment from Stacy A, who said, Rey, though admittedly the third movie in the trilogy is far too late to introduce this particular character development. Had Rey fallen to the dark side earlier in the Disney sequel series, she would have made for a compelling and sympathetic villain. It would have gone a long way in redeeming her more Mary Sue qualities and overpowered Force abilities by setting her up as a villain to truly be feared, a villain that could actually beat the heroes once and for all. Watching her fall into darkness and Kylo Ren mirroring her journey with a return to the light would have upped the emotional stakes because, as has been established right from The Force Awakens, Rey can easily beat Kylo in a duel. Could a redeemed Kylo Ren finally beat her in combat after so many failures? Could the Force be balanced by two Force users that have learned to embrace both the light and the dark? It's probably too late to do such a storyline effectively, but I would have certainly been more interested in Rey going forward if it wasn't so obvious that Disney won't allow her to be anything other than a morally infallible deus ex machina. And I really couldn't agree more here. If Rey takes Kylo Ren's hand at the end of Episode 8, even if it's just in an attempt to eventually turn him back to the light side, and then in Episode 9 she starts to slip further and further to the dark side despite herself, and Kylo Ren watches this fall, watches as someone he starts to genuinely and truly care about lose themselves to the darkness, it could have slowly started to bring him back to the light, and set up some type of final battle where they'd essentially flipped sides. And yeah, I know I sound like I've gone full Reylo with this theory, but as I've said all along about this trilogy, one of the keys to it was setting up an interesting dynamic between Rey and Kylo, and that I believe would have been one very interesting way to do it. Alright, our next comment here comes to us from John Bones, who said, Darth Jar Jar, seriously, we are not kids anymore. This twist would have been superb. And I don't know about this one. I don't know how it would go over with the general audience. He was just so goofy in Episode 1 that I can't see him acting all along, and he's actually one of the most powerful Sith ever, that he'd denigrate himself like that, even to achieve his ultimate goal. I've always thought Jar Jar was so lucky, not because he was a Sith doing it on purpose to fool people, but because the Force has a way of working through certain individuals, and it ends up looking like the most baffling luck ever. Okay, let's get to just a few more comments, starting with this one from Vaughn Glover, who said, an entirely new threat would have been the way to go from my point of view, and I don't mean Snoke. If I had to create one, it would have been a religious zealot of sorts with the means to destroy the entire galaxy, and then recreate it for the betterment of all. Not only would this be a grave threat for the heroes, but to the villains and the Force itself. And I do really like this idea. As I've said before, the prequels were all about the fall of the Republic and the Jedi. The original trilogy was all about the return of the Jedi and the Republic, and the sequel should have been some type of test for both of them, for the re-established Jedi and Republic. Not a retelling of both the previous trilogies wrapped up into one. Some type of new external threat, one that threatened the very galaxy itself, would have been the way to go. Alright, next up we have this comment from Cereal and Whiskey, who said, this is like saying what kind of ice cream would you have gotten if you didn't wrap the car around a tree a block from the house? Does it matter? Well, for the record, I would have gotten mint chocolate chip, and Plagueis would have been my pick for the sequel trilogy. Then we have this comment from Andrew Hancock, who said, Rian Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy fuse, and Jedi Master George Lucas has to stop them. Hey, I'd watch it. And finally here, we have this comment from Samuel Karin, who said, Rey should become the villain and Kylo the hero. And honestly, I think that would have been a great route to take. So many people want to say that Rey is a Mary Sue, and we can certainly have that debate. So okay, make all that power she's amassed so easily, and turn her to the dark side. Make it her weakness. Just do something interesting with her. that no one would have ever suspected coming. Really subvert our expectations here. Problem is, the plan with Rey all along has seemed to be just to turn her into the perfect iconic female character and role model, instead of worrying about how she fits into the story and what's going to make for the absolute best, most interesting character. It's never been about the story with her, it's been about selling a character. Okay, and before ending this video, let me point you in the direction of a really cool fan-edited trailer for Episode 9 from Viz Edits, a link to which can be found in the description and or comments below. And even if you don't care about the movie coming up, it's still worth checking out. It was fantastic, and it might end up being more emotional than the movie ends up being. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to let me know who you think the villain of Episode 9 should have been, and if you would have liked to have seen Rey go to the dark side and end up being the big bad guy or girl of this trilogy. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.